and I'm one of the co-conveners, along with Helen Hayes, of the Civic and Moral Education Initiative here at the Ed School, and I'm really glad to see you here. I know there's some familiar faces. The fact that there's some unfamiliar faces doesn't actually tell me much because you may have been here a lot and I don't have facial recognition, so I wouldn't know. But I'm really glad that we have you here today for our first colloquium of the spring semester with Larry Blum. Before I introduce him, I want to say you've all gotten, I think, a copy of our new newsletter, hot off the press. Many thanks to Julia Higdon, CNEI's RA and editor and publisher and everything else for putting it together. We hope you enjoy reading it. It'll also be up on our Ning. Speaking of our Ning, if you are not yet a member of our listserv, we encourage you to sign up. Even if you are, we strongly encourage you to sign your name on the sign-in sheet that Julia is going to be sending around, just because this gives us the capacity to keep track of our numbers and make the ongoing case to the dean, who has been very supportive over now 5 years, to continue supporting us. So we have some upcoming colloquia, as you'll see on the newsletter. I'm actually presenting in a few weeks on dilemmas of justice in schools, and we have Irvin Staub later in the semester presenting on Israel-Palestine conflict and teaching violence and some conflict resolution. We have Jim Lee from Brown University, and we also have Rick Weisbord from here at the Ed School who will be presenting colloquia later this semester. So at this point, I'm really excited to introduce, now I think, an old friend. Right? We've known each other for over a decade now. Larry Blum. Professor Blum is the distinguished professor of university professor, is that right? Of liberal arts and education? Merely a distinguished professor, but it's like UMass Boston's highest level. He's a high muckety-muck at UMass Boston, and one of the CMEI colloquium. Welcome, come in. And actually, one of the sort of initial generation of professors who created UMass Boston to be a high-quality urban university serving a diverse student population, including a non-traditional student population. Since then, he has written, published 5 books, including what for me was a seminal book, I'm Not a Racist But, and more recently, the book that you will be sort of drawing on today, High School's Race in America's Future, What Students Can Teach Us About Morality, Diversity, and Community. Larry is a philosopher and also very much of an educator, in addition to the work that he's done at the university level for many, many years. As he'll discuss, he also taught high school students at Cambridge and Latin School for 4 years, a version of his college course about race and racism. And he is now taking a show on the road, most recently last year teaching in South Africa for a few months. And so I'm really excited to have him. I'm also really excited to have Aliyah El-Amin, a doctoral student here, provide a response, serve as our discussant afterwards. Aliyah is working on her dissertation, developing a novel theory of racial of activism and sort of racial navigation and transformation within a racist society for African Americans. That I'm her advisor, and I think it's fabulous and very exciting. And she's done a lot of work as an educator and as an administrator in the Atlanta Public Schools and as a director of TFA Charlotte. And she also has done lots of work internationally, working with teachers and policymakers and educators in training through TFA in Nigeria and South Africa and India, sort of all over. So she'll be an excellent respondent. And then, as always, we will open up for a robust discussion following Larry's talk and Aliyah's response. And we've scheduled these long so we can have a good time for discussion. We also recognize that people may need to leave early, so you don't need to, look apologetic. It's okay if you need to leave early. And with that, I'll hand it over to Larry.
Thank you very much. I regard myself as sort of a friend of CMEI, but I never presented before, and I'm really glad to be able to do so. So I'm going to describe for you this course that I taught at Cambridge in Latin, the high school up the street from here, the large comprehensive high school of Cambridge. I don't have any background as a high school teacher, but I made an arrangement with the district after teaching for several decades at UMass Boston. I was starting to teach in the education program and feeling a little bit of dissonance that I was teaching people who were going to work in the K-12 sector, and I never had any experience in that sector, but also I had, for maybe the last 25 years or so, become particularly interested in racial issues after several decades prior to that of being sort of more like a straight moral philosopher. And I had been teaching courses on race and racism at the university and was just interested in what would happen to, to be able to teach that material at the high school level. Because it's my local high school, my 3 children all went through that high school, and I knew people at the school, and that sort of facilitated my being able to teach the course. So I arranged to teach it once, and then they invited me back 3 more times to teach it. So I taught it a total of 4 times, and then they moved to a block scheduling system that sort of squeezed out courses like mine. So that was the end. So I'm going to start by describing the course, and then I'm going to describe my kind of my students in the course. So the course had race as the central topic, and I wasn't sure that the students were totally aware that race was something that you could study like chemistry or European history, and I wanted to make it clear that race was something which, while you experienced things about it and had opinions about it, it was also something that you could learn about. You could learn things that you didn't know already, that it had a large history as well. And the course was primarily a historical course, and you might say it was a course about the historical construction of the idea of race itself. Where does the idea of race come from? So, and we were sort of looking particularly at the Americas. So it kind of largely goes back to around the 16th century, and that's where we started. But I also wanted students to recognize that race had become a kind of scientific idea, or sort of like a popular idea with a strong scientific patina or kind of legitimacy to it, and for much of its history it was thought of as a scientifically valid idea, and then in the 20th century scientists kind of made an about-face about the idea of race and basically rejected it and said that the historical notion of race was basically invalid. A slight qualification to this, I just heard a talk today by Larry Bobo, who pointed out that there has been a kind of revival of a sort of quasi-racialist thinking within some sciences. So I think it's still true to say that no one agrees with the notion of race that has come down to us through the 18th and 19th century, but there's maybe newer versions that there's disagreement with. The framework was also comparative in the course. I wanted students, because I wanted them to see that race was a constructed idea, I thought an important way to demonstrate that is to see that it's constructed differently in different regions and areas. So in particular, we looked at Latin America and the Caribbean, and looked at the development of slave systems in those areas, and how the slave systems in those 2 areas compared to the U.S. and compared to each other had given rise to different conceptions of race. And one of the reasons I did that, not the primary one, but several of my students were from Caribbean backgrounds or Latin American backgrounds, and it's kind of well known that people coming from those regions to the United States, especially from from Latin America, find the American racial order and racial category system kind of confusing and feel that they don't fit into that, and I wanted them to understand something of the historical background for why they, why they had the notions of race they had, and they were different from the notions that we have in the United States. But as I say, I also thought just the comparative dimension itself is particularly important in sort of reinforcing the idea of race as sort of a constructed idea. So the course was meant to be especially intellectually demanding. So in a certain sense, it was like an honors course. It wasn't officially designated an honors course at the time, but it was portrayed to the student body as a kind of taste of college, and it had UMass in the title of the course. So the idea was that it was supposed to give students a sense of the level of intellectual demand they would get if they went to college. And I made sure that it did that. The course also had sort of a strong moral component, partly because it seemed to me that the students' experience of race was sort of shot through with moral notions and moral sensibilities. But of course, I'm also bringing my background as a moral philosopher to it, so I asked explicitly moral questions, but they also came up with those questions themselves. The class was also very heterogeneous in the sense of the students coming from very different sort of academic achievement backgrounds, you might say. And I wanted to be a class that had that kind of diversity within it. And so it was sort of a challenge to teach students who were coming from very different backgrounds in terms of their academic achievement. The high school is sort of remarkable in this respect. It has a huge sort of range, although most of the students do end up going to college. There are a small number of students who don't go to college, and every year I had some students who didn't go to college after high school and never went to college. But it was a challenge to try to figure out how to do that kind of heterogeneous teaching, especially since the framing idea of the course was this historical construction of race, which is a very sophisticated idea. You have to, first of all, understand race as a kind of idea, sort of like a way of looking at the world, and that's not the way people normally, high school students normally think about race. They think about race as something that people just are. It's just like part of who they are. So getting it to be recognized as a kind of idea is very intellectually challenging, and then also recognizing that it's an idea that changed over time, over the several centuries of its development. So race didn't mean the same thing in the 17th century as it meant in the 19th century and then in the 20th century, and sort of understanding how developments in slavery and developments in the history of science sort of affected and religious developments as well, sort of affected the conception of race was, I think, also a very kind of challenging idea. So while the sort of main framework of the course that I was always sort of pushing students to engage with was very intellectually challenging, I felt that I had to have some material in the class that wasn't as kind of intellectually sophisticated as that. So just to take one example, I had the students read several slave narratives, which of course are very experiential. So we read one called The Story of Mary Prince. Mary Prince was the first female to write a slave narrative that was published. It was around 1830, I'm not sure exactly. But, you know, that's a text that people can sort of get into from different levels of sophistication in terms of their background. And the questions that I asked students about that text were nevertheless headed towards the more critical thinking way of dealing with their material. So I had an assignment in which I asked students to talk about Mary Prince's changing conception of what she thought was wrong with slavery over time. So that's different from just asking what were the differences in Mary Prince's own experiences of slavery. It sort of ramped it up an intellectual level. So, you know, I was always, in a way, encouraging and trying to develop their powers of critical thinking, but I thought the material itself, there needed to be a lot of different entry points to it, given the heterogeneity So course material and assignments, I mean, I talk about these at the end of the book. I sort of list all my assignments, but let me just mention one more to you. So I had an assignment that I called the racial empathy assignment. It's a quite complex one where students had to find someone of a different race than themselves, and then they had to interview that person using a set of questions that the class had generated together, but of course they could also follow some path that came up in their individual interview that wasn't planned for in that set of questions. Then they had to write up the interview, and the interview was sort of focused on your interviewee's kind of racialized experience and how they thought about race and how they looked at race in the United States and so on. So they turned that into me, and then I gave them suggested follow-up questions. They had to re-interview the person, and then they had to write an essay in the voice of the student about the student's way of looking at the world from their particular racial position. And then the student had to sort of comment on what they themselves had learned about someone of that race. And there were a lot of different racial pairings in this assignment. It was great. It was a great assignment. Now, because of this being the CMEI, the course had some quite modest, I would say, civic goals, but they were there. I didn't just have to come up with them because I'm presenting it. So I thought of the course as being a kind of basic racial literacy. Like Americans are really pretty ignorant about race, and they don't think they need to know anything about race. And in a sense, a lot of Americans don't even recognize that race is something you know things about. It's more something you avoid like the plague, sort of thing. And in a way, Obama's election, while great in many ways, has sort of fed the idea that we're sort of past all that, and race isn't something that we need to really learn about because it's such an important part of American history. But I wanted my students to not emerge from high school with that level of ignorance and a kind of self-reinforced ignorance or self-legitimized ignorance. So I thought of this historical backdrop as something that, in a way, everyone should know about this. So it doesn't, in a certain sense, dictate your view on, like, the charged issues of the moment, like racial profiling or affirmative action. But it's like you can't have an intelligent conversation about any of those issues unless you know this backdrop. So I saw it as a basic racial literacy. I also thought another kind of civic capacity was the ability to engage with and learn from differently situated others, differently situated in kind of racial, ethnic, linguistic, economic, various other differences between people. That's an important part of a civic capability, is to be able to engage with people who are different from you, and especially in the racial area, people haven't learned to do that particularly well. And then finally, this is extremely modest. I'm not over-claiming about this, but I was hoping that being in a class of racial others would help people to sort of encourage the sense that they had a shared fate with and had a sense of civic connection with people of other races, and that could then hopefully somewhat generalize out. Now, I know you can't, there's no direct connection between being attached to X, Y, and Z and then being attached to all members of the racial group of which X, Y, Z are members. But I thought it was a time to start in any case. So, okay, now let me say something about the students in the class. But before doing that, I want to say that I think a course like this could work for virtually any demographic, even like an all-white class or an all-black class or an all-Latino class. So maybe those aren't ideal demographics, but nevertheless the material is so rich and it's so important and significant that I just want to reinforce my sense that this is something that's possible to do and worth doing. The one demographic that I would stay away from is if you had something like 15% or less students of color and 85% white students. I think there's a kind of worry of hypervisibility in that kind of demographic. I wouldn't say you should never do that, but I think it's a a demographic that is not ideal for this maturity. So in terms of my own demographic, the high school was slightly gimmicky, but it was also good that we had this idea that the class would reflect the general demographic of the high school itself, which is a minority white high school. There maybe at the time, maybe about a third of the students were white, and maybe 42% were black, 15% were Latino, 7 or 8% Asian. There were several others sort of in groups like Middle East, which don't have an official standing yet, but there's, in terms of the sort of evolving racial order in the United States, there were various others in that sense. And occasionally I would have a Native American student or a student with some Native American ancestry. And so that demographic of the school was reflected inside my class. Of course, it was different every year because you can't completely control who's signing up for a class. Students can just sign up for a class. I couldn't make sure I had an exact quota. I couldn't do a quota system, but I could work with the guidance counselors. And over the years, I got better at this. They sort of saw what the point of the course was, and they sent me the kind of students that I was, would help me sort of balance out the class. So one reason that I wanted to have a majority of Black and Latino students is because of achievement gap issues, where Blacks and Latinos, educational outcomes are not as significantly less than white and Asians, as kind of whole race groups. Of course, there are a lot of differences, different ethnic groups within each of those, but just speaking at the general racial level. And I just didn't want to teach another course that was an advanced course that had mostly white students in it. I wanted to teach a course that was an advanced course and it had mostly Black and Latino students in it. So the Black and Latino students who took the class, I'd say almost all of them had either not taken any AP classes or had maybe tried taking like one AP class. But there were other students at the school who take like many AP classes, and I didn't want to have that kind of student in the class that much. So for the Blacks and Latinos, it was sort of an experience that was different from other classes they'd taken. There are many classes that are majority Black and Latino, but they aren't at the honors or advanced level. So for them, the experience of being, if you put Blacks and Latinos together, they were always a majority, and every once in a while Blacks were a majority of the class. That was a different experience than they would have had in their other classes. And I wanted to do my tiny little bit of closing up that gap, or at least not making it worse. But I wouldn't have wanted to have a class that was all Black and Latino, although you could make a case that I should have done so, because I wanted to have the element of the cross-racial engagement and conversation, and that's why I wanted students of all racial groups. So that was kind of a second goal of the course. And that's, so I always made sure that there were some white students in the class. As time went on and the course became sort of more official, more and more students signed up ahead of time, and I had to turn away a fair number of students. And Black students were turned away. And even though Black students were the largest group within the class, they were also a group that was turned away in the largest numbers, and whites were the second most turned away group, so to speak. Another form of diversity within the class was kind of immigrant and non-immigrant. I always had some immigrant students, but immigrants. So sociologists use this expression 1.5 to mean someone who immigrated at a young age and doesn't have an accent, so that they can sometimes, in a certain sense, pass as a native person. So some of my immigrant students were like that, and some of them were actually immigrants who, immigrated at a later age, and you could tell from their speech that they were immigrants. So that dynamic was also part of the class. And then there was ethnic mix within the racial group, and especially the Black group. I mean, the Latinos were there was always ethnic mix among Latinos, because unlike in Arizona or California, Latinos in the Boston area and Cambridge area are from a lot of different national backgrounds. I mean, it's true in those other states as well, but I mean, you could give a class that had all Mexican Americans in the United States. That would be unlikely to happen. So there was a lot of mix within the Latino group, but there was also ethnic mix within the black group, and that was an interesting aspect of the class. So Cambridge, as you probably know, has a large Haitian population. So there were always a couple Haitians, and as the years went on, there were more Haitians in the class, and there were other Afro-Caribbeans who were non-Haitians, Dominican or Jamaican or Barbadian. And then also, finally, the last point about this is that the kind of student I was aiming for, which I've kind of implied already, is a student who was reaching for college, but wouldn't necessarily be absolutely sure in the way they, it wouldn't necessarily be taken for granted in the family they were growing up in, that they definitely would go to college, even though they might have had that in their own mind. So I didn't, in particular, I wanted to rule out people from very educated families, very educated backgrounds, and college was absolutely something that there was just no question that they would always go to. I didn't want that kind of student in the class. Now, I couldn't totally keep them because of the sign-up way that people got into the class. So I always had one or two students who did end up, going to very selective colleges. But the kind of student I was looking for, in a way, the modal student, was a student who would be coming to UMass Boston. And in fact, there were always some students who did come to UMass Boston. Quite a few also went to UMass Amherst as well. Okay, so now let me just say a little bit about the kind of white teacher, student of color dynamic issues. So I, of course, was very aware of myself as not only a white teacher, I was so much older than them, and there were just a lot of differences between me and them. There was a vast gap that I was always struggling with. So I don't have anything too profound to say about this, but just some little guidelines that I used. First of all, I wanted the students to recognize that a kind of scholarly relationship to issues of race and racism, and really more generally an interest in issues of race and racism, was not confined to people of color. That white people could be interested in this and even become scholars in it, and people who were able to teach at the university level about those. So in that sense, I was kind of deracializing the scholarly interest. But at the same time, I felt that I had to make it clear that that as a white person, there might be things that I didn't understand about their experience, and that I was always open to learning from them. So one time, it was the first time out, we had this sort of embarrassing for me exchange where several students disagreed with an interpretation I'd given of a film strip we had seen. And at one point, one of the students said, "Mr. Blum, I think that you don't understand what's going on there because you're white." So that's pretty embarrassing. And, even mortifying, you might say. So I went home and I sort of thought about what the students had said, and I sort of saw that they were right. And I was mortified that I had kind of missed what was going on in this film, but so I came back and acknowledged that they were indeed right about this, and that white people miss a lot of stuff, and they have to be open to learning from students and from people of color more generally. In particular, I also, this is a separate point in a certain way, that when students present themselves as having experienced racism or racial discrimination or racial put-downs of some kind, I thought it was particularly important to affirm that, because a lot of students of color have the experience of white people not really believing that really happened to them. So, I just gave this, I talked in this book at college a couple of days ago, and a black student said that when she talks about her own experience, these are other students now, often say, "I feel you're attacking me," well, that's a depressing response to someone who's just talking about their experience, but it does signal an issue, I think, for white educators. And then also to show a belief in students' capabilities, this thing about high expectations can become a mantra that verges on the meaningless, and sometime in a chapter of the book that sort of talks about that. But I did think it very important to affirm, especially individually, that I believe that the student could do good work. And some of these students really hadn't ever encountered a course that was as demanding as this one, and some of them articulated, I'm getting a worse grade in this class than I would if I had taken this other CP level class. And so, that was something that I had to deal with. And I also thought it was particularly important to be really interested in what the students had to say, which was not something that I had to work at doing, because every day was like completely fascinating, and what they were saying was always so interesting that I made sure that they knew that I felt that way. And more generally, to show that I tried to show that I was sort of on their side. So one time, a student in a kind of open journal that you could talk about anything you wanted, a student described how he'd gone for a job. This was in Cambridge. He'd gone for a black student, kind of a large black boy, a big black boy, had gone for a job, and he had been told there was no job. I forget whether it had been filled or whatever. He was told there was no job, and then a white friend of his went for the same job and was offered the job. And he wrote in his journal, he wrote, Mr. Blum, do you think I was discriminated against? So every evidence was that he was, but I thought interesting that he was kind of trying to figure it out, because you don't really want to think that you're discriminated against. And a lot of people think, black people, they're always claiming victimhood and all that. But I didn't really find that at all. I think the students were trying to sort of figure out the world that they were living in, and what the racial lay of the land was. But I thought it was important for me to affirm that it looked to me like this kid was discriminated against, and I wrote a letter to the establishment in question, basically saying, I'm watching you, kind of, that my student had described the situation, and I told the student that I had done it. And I think white teachers have to find ways of making clear that you're kind of on the side of the students. Okay, so now some kind of issues that were raised in the class of mostly kind of a moral character. So one general issue that you might say is raised in morality is whether people's racial identities have some bearing on the rightness or wrongness of actions. Like you might think, something's wrong independent of the race of the person who engages in it. So this is tested, and I want to give you a sort of extended example. This was a discussion that came off of a racial incident assignment where I'd asked students to describe a racial incident that had happened that they were a party to. So here's the one, and then they decided, I made a list of them, and they decided which one to discuss. Here's the one they decided to discuss. Quote, in elementary school, I, a Latino, went to a Latino-themed dance. A white couple was there dancing, and some Latino kids made fun of them for their stiff white hips. Other Latino kids laughed at this statement. End quote. So I asked the students, well, what would you do if you were in a situation like that? Because I didn't start with, what do you think you should do? Because I didn't want them to go straight for what they think the right thing to do. I wanted to sort of emerge from what they thought they actually would do. So here's a discussion, and I'll just say these are four different students. They're all black. The first ones to talk. Norris. If I was in that situation, I would laugh at the white couple too, and everyone else would laugh at them too. Jean-Paul. If I were black, I'd laugh. If I were Latino, I'd laugh. But if I were white, I wouldn't know how to dance. So, ... Norris. I'm not trying to offend them, the white couple, but I would still think that white people are too stiff to dance well. Ebony. Who are you to say they're stiff or not? Antonine. But they are. So this is, this kind of little snatch of conversation is quite interesting because Jean-Paul already starts, he says, if I were black, if I were Latino, he's imagining himself in other subject positions. He doesn't go too far with that, and he goes for sort of a laugh. If I were white, I wouldn't know how to dance. But it's kind of interesting that even though he says he'd laugh, he's kind of bringing in a kind of a new element about seeing things from another point of view. Norris at least says he's not trying to offend them, and then there's this discussion of whether white people are too stiff to dance well, and Ebony challenges that, but I don't know what the follow-up of that is exactly. So then a little further down the road, Jacques, a black student, says, this reminds me of Comic View, a TV show that apparently makes use of the stereotype of white dancers as stiff-hipped. I don't think it's necessarily racist or something that people should be offended by. Antonine, the stereotype is already in the air. Christina is Latina. If they have stiff hips, that's one thing, but when they say stiff white hips, it means they're insulting all white people. So there's two really interesting things about this exchange. One is the idea that if there's a stereotype that's kind of already out there, and especially if it's used for humor on a TV show, then there can't really be any grounds for complaint about it. It's too, you're not making it up, you're not doing something that the people would have hadn't been exposed to before, so that's kind of an interesting thing. And then Christine is the first person to bring a racial thing into it, stiff white hips. She says, that insults all white people. So that raises this kind of larger issue about how race figures into the rightness and wrongness of kind of exchanges and interactions. Okay, so going further, Hannah, a white student, it's okay on Comic View to make fun of whites, but what if a white person was on Comic View making fun of blacks? Okay, stop there. So she raises this thing that I call racial symmetry. She thinks that, she assumes that if white people made fun of blacks, that would be wrong, and that the same has to apply to black or Latinos making fun of whites. So she makes this assumption in a way that there is a bit of racial symmetry. But the students reject her premise. They don't engage the issue because they say that on Comic View, there were white people making fun of blacks on the show the previous night. So she didn't get any uptake of that issue, which is kind of a shame. But as the conversation kept going, so Ebony, who's the one who challenged it a minute ago, Ebony says, listening to this discussion, I guess I'm changing my mind. I guess if I saw it, I would laugh, but I wouldn't say all white people in general. So she's kind of responding to this kind of racialization issue that Christina had brought out, and she also is the first student to admit that she's changing her opinion. So other people backpedal a little bit. She's the first one to admit that she backpedaled. This might not seem like such a big deal, but often in racial conversations, people never backpedal. They're too defensive. People aren't willing to admit that they've said something wrong because it's such a kind of minefield territory that if you admitted you were wrong, you might admit that the previous thing you said was quote-unquote racist, and that wouldn't be so horrible. So I was struck by Ebony's being able to backtrack. Of course, you could say, well, for a black student, she's less vulnerable to that charge, but even so, I thought it was actually impressive that Ebony was able to do that. So then Christina says, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't say anything, but I would probably go and dance with the person and show the person how to dance. And Esteban says, I would take, both of them are Latino, I would take the opportunity to meet them and teach them. Okay, so I thought this was a really fascinating kind of intervention on Christina's part, where she's going from kind of analyzing what's wrong with the situation to sort of talking about what she would do about it. And what she would do about it is, instead of saying to people who are laughing at the couple, you shouldn't say that, that's not very nice, people aren't to dance with us, or even you're being racist or, insulting. she goes straight, she says she's going to go straight in and dance with that couple. And I thought this was an extremely sensitive way to think about intervening in a situation like that, because it carries the same message as telling other people that what they're saying isn't very nice to do. It's expressing solidarity with the couple who's at the dance, and because she's Latina, although she didn't sort of highlight that aspect, so I'm not quite sure how she was thinking of it, but it means that it's sort of including this couple in the community of the dance, and sort of after they've been made fun of, and it's kind of humiliating to be made fun of at a dance. She's saying that she would sort of bring herself into that, kind of help to bring them into the circle of the acceptable and appropriate people at the dance, and Esteban kind of gets in the spirit of that and says he would do that as well. So I did wonder whether Christina either tacitly or actually was thinking about herself as a Latina when she was thinking about this, but I couldn't find that out at the moment. So, okay, now the class period is almost over, and Jacques, the black student I mentioned earlier, chimes in with a whole new perspective. He says, I can see where the Latinos, those who are making fun of the white couple, are coming from, he says. These whites are intruding on the scene. So if Latino people are having a good time, why did white people impose? So several black students get on his case immediately, kind of jump all over him, including people who earlier said they would laugh at the white couple. And they say, so Mirvol says, if I went to the dance, for example, as a black person, would I be imposing? They were quite outraged by Jacques saying, but then the period was over. So it's this thing that often happens, this great conversation starts, and the class is over. But Jacques is a very thoughtful guy, and he came up to me after class, and he wanted to tell me that what he wanted to explain his remark. He said, minority groups have to be protective of their own cultural territory. There's always a danger that whites will come in and take it from them. I thought that's a quite insightful perspective, because historically that is true. Jacques might very well have been thinking primarily of sort of hip-hop and the way hip-hop has been sort of appropriated, not necessarily in the production of it exactly, but in the consumption, at least the consumption and the kind of public face of it by white suburban kids. And so he raises an issue of asymmetry, which is kind of an answer to what Hannah had raised as a symmetry issue before. He's saying that basically people of color have to be able to protect their space, and so it's okay if they do things to protect their space. I don't think he was directly saying it's fine to make fun of them. I think he was like going for sort of a related but kind of a different point in a way, but still one that was relevant. Now, unfortunately, we didn't get to talk about that issue because, he mentioned it to me after class. But let me sort of formally define racial symmetry here on the outline D1B1 or 1. So to say that there's racial symmetry is to say that the moral character of an action or an incident is not affected by the racial identities of the parties to it. Or another way of saying it is, or another aspect of the symmetry is racial groups are equivalently situated with respect to race-related wrongs. So issues of symmetry came up a lot in the class, and I want to give you. Another one came up around a discussion of pride and skin color that came off of a historical figure we read from David Walker, who's a very well-known black abolitionist, a Boston-based person. He's not, unfortunately, that well-known, but he should be because he's really fantastic. But he said, black people have the color that God gave them, and they have pride in that color, and they are pleased at the color that God gave them. And I asked whether he's implying that every group should have pride in their own skin color. So here's what the students say. Clara, if she's Latina. It should be the same, but pride in being white has a more negative connotation because it's always connected to being superior. Pina, who's as Asian. White isn't seen as negative. If you look in the dictionary, the definitions of white are all positive: lightness, sun, purity. Black is connected with dark, something you're afraid of. Adam, white. Whites have power, and white pride is connected with that, but still, saying you're proud to be white isn't necessarily supporting white superiority. Cheryl in black. If a white person said, I'm proud of being white, my first reaction would be, are you saying you're better than me? Tenzina, who's both Hispanic and Asian. Whether it's okay to say you are proud of your skin color depends on who's saying it. Like if it's a racist friend of yours saying it, that is more suspicious. She holds her arm up to foreground her own skin color, and she says, Asians don't say, I'm proud of being yellow. So it was really interesting. Everyone completely cracked up when she said this. She's not usually a student. I don't think she'd ever gone for last before, but that was perfect comic timing on her part. And then Pima says, Asians don't, she's an Asian student, Asians don't think of themselves as yellow. Jacques says, whites and blacks identify with their race, Asians don't. And Tenzina replies, what are you actually proud of? In the case of blacks, it's empowering to take pride in your skin color. So, you know, that conversation kind of keeps going towards the end of the period. Anna, a white student, says, you don't have pride in your skin color, you have pride in your culture. Okay, so there's a lot of quite complex things going on there. There's a general recognition that there's an asymmetry in the expression of pride in skin color, that it doesn't have the same meaning if a black person does it, if an Asian person does it, if a white person does it. Different meanings attached to that. And so, you know, and then some of them are saying pride in skin color is really you're really taking pride in something different than your skin color. Skin color is just taken as a symbol of it. But then after class, Jacques, the same student came up after class the other time, said, you can have pride in your skin color if there's an ideology that says your skin color is bad, and then you can have pride to reject that ideology. So that kind of hit one important nail on the head there, because he recognized, and this, he was getting this from our study of the ideology of black inferiority that has so permeated American history, especially, you know, through the rise of slavery and the ideology of race that grew up around it. And so he's kind of saying the reason that for blacks to express pride in skin color is for them to reject that ideology. But the ideology of inferiority doesn't apply to whites. So when whites express pride in their skin color, they can't be rejecting an analogous ideology, where there is no ideology out there to reject. So Jacques has really seen and articulated very nicely, although unfortunately after class, an important asymmetry between what in this case between black and white, but it's really between white and any other racial group. So let me give you one other example. And then, so this again was a kind of end of the period conversation. So Hannah, a white student, says, I was in an African American literature class this semester, but when I got there, I was the only white student and I didn't feel comfortable. I was worried what the black students would think of me, although none of them actually said anything that made me feel uncomfortable, but I transferred out of the class and took this class instead. So throughout the class, various students of color had talked about their experience in white-dominated advanced classes and their sort of discomfort. So then I asked this question coming off of that and Hannah's statement. I said, would a white kid in an all-black class feel uncomfortable in the same way as a black kid in an all-white class? So Mirvol, who's black, says, it isn't the same. It would be different kinds of uncomfortable. So I thought that was a great way to put it, different kinds of uncomfortable. And I sort of pressed her to sort of flesh that out, and she couldn't really do it. And with only 1 second left, I wanted to get my point in there. So I said, well, One thing some people might feel is that if the black student was the only student, she might be worried that the white students would think that she did not belong in the class, that she was not a good enough student to be there. But no one would make that particular assumption about the one white student in the all-black class. Revolt says, that's exactly what I meant. That doesn't mean it is exactly what she meant, but anyway, I think I caught her sense of that asymmetry between these two different cases. So let me just end with one sort of reflection on this asymmetry idea. So you can think of one way of thinking about sort of morality in the area of race is there's issues of kind of systemic injustice, and then there's issues of kind of interpersonal interaction. And very often, people have rightly complained that when people think about morality, they only focus on this interpersonal thing, like do you treat people with respect, do you show prejudice, do you use bad language? It's always on this interpersonal level, and the bigger picture of structural injustice gets lost. So you can then sort of shift to thinking, well, what really counts is the area of systemic injustice, and in a way, I agree with that. At the same time, the interpersonal level is a level of morality. And what I think is helpful about the asymmetry idea is it helps you it's sort of like something that's inside the interpersonal level, but it invokes the larger level. So like what Jacques was saying about the ideology of black inferiority, that's part of the bigger picture, but it sort of comes into the issue of who can take pride in their skin color. And similarly with his point about people of color having to sort of defend their own cultural spaces. So in that sense, I think that the idea of sort of recognizing racial asymmetries in these interpersonal situations can also sort of help to invoke the larger picture. I mean, I was giving the students the larger picture anyway, but I'm just saying as a sort of conceptual matter. Okay, so I hardly got through any of my outline here, but my time is up, and so I'll just stop, and if you want to ask me something else, okay, that's fine.
Well, first, I think it's just really exciting to have a professor and a teacher both teaching a course like this at the K-12 level and then being really sort of honest and reflective about what that experience has been like and sharing it with other people who might be interested in topics like this and teaching topics like this at the K-12 level. I guess maybe I'll pick up like right exactly where you were kind of leaving off because I think this notion of racial symmetry and racial asymmetry was really interesting to me as I had the chance to flip through Professor Blum's book, and you were just starting to really get into it. So just because for me it was really hard to just make sure I had my head around the difference between the two, I'm going to just read the definition that Professor Blum has in the book. And so basically saying that racial symmetry means that whether any act or practice that involves race is morally right or wrong is independent of the racial identities of the people involved. And so he gives this great example where he's saying if a black kid excludes or makes fun of a white kid, that's no more or less wrong than if a white kid excludes or makes fun of a black kid. And he's sort of just given us a little bit of an example of that. And then racial asymmetry says that the wrongness or the rightness, or at least the degree of wrongness or rightness, does depend on the racial identities of the people involved. And so, for example, in what he just shared with us, it could be wrong of white people to take over a minority event because of the sort of history of co-option, but not necessarily the same kind of wrong for a Latino group to be involved or take over a white event. And as I thought a lot about that yesterday, I was sort of struck with how difficult it was for me to think about a situation where racial asymmetry was not present. So in other words, I had a really difficult time thinking about a situation that was purely racially symmetrical, right? Where the identities of the people were the sort of moral decision about whether or not it was right or wrong, was independent of the racial identities of the people involved. And that got me really thinking about the more responsibility of the teacher in a class like this to present or discuss or talk about racial asymmetries when they are potentially missed by students. So as we can see in the last couple examples that you just shared, a lot of the racial asymmetries were mentioned to you after class, or you would notice that a student came up with this idea that actually it's not quite the same, right? Because the identity here shifts a little bit of the responsibility, but the conversation around it didn't necessarily have a chance to unfold. So I'd be curious whether or not you think that within the course like this, there is a serious implication for an educator or the teacher to make that space, to really ensure that those asymmetries are highlighted, to the extent that the last thing that you just shared was that it really helps to illuminate the broader macro picture of what's happening with race and racism in our country. So I'll say that, and then the other question I had is I was actually trying to think in my own teaching experience whether or not I taught 4th and 5th grade in Atlanta, Georgia, in a homogenous teaching environment, all African Americans, and I was trying to think about whether or not my students would have any trouble or had any trouble defining sort of the asymmetries in some of the situations that Professor Blum brought up. And I actually felt like they wouldn't. I felt like they would actually be able to hone in on the ways in which a situation would have different degrees of rightness or wrongness dependent on a racial identity. And I wondered, in your experience, if you would say that the inability to potentially see that was more of a white phenomenon and was something that more white students would struggle with, and that students of color might be more easily able to identify where issues of power or racial identity were playing into how you might interpret a situation morally. So I think I'll leave it at that. And maybe the last point I'll make that's different from this idea of racial symmetry or racial asymmetry is the amount of reflection that you could hear Professor Blum doing about the skills or the capacities that students would use in order to talk about these issues. So he mentioned a lot about perspective taking, about empathy, about the ability to scrutinize yourself or sort of backpedal. And even within the book, he's reflecting a lot about when he's noticing students be able to do that and congratulating them for that. But I didn't necessarily notice an explicitness with them about the fact that these skills are potentially really important in conversations about race, particularly as we're thinking about morality of race, and whether or not there's value in courses like this to name those skills for students, and to talk about how self-scrutiny, how perspective taking, how empathy really makes these conversations be even more productive, and potentially equips them or empowers them to reflect themselves to the extent to which they're using it. Are they at this moment being empathetic or putting themselves in somebody else's shoes, or are they having trouble backpedaling on a position they had previously put out there before, even if they're hearing information that's shifting their position? And so I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about whether or not there is value in naming those skills in these conversations. So I'll leave that at that, and you're
Great. Larry, do you want to take a minute or two to respond to Aaliyah's questions? Or?
I'd be glad to. Whatever you think is the best way to proceed.
I can take a minute or two and then we'll
Okay. So I did sometimes name those skills. That's a great point. That's a really great point. I think it is important for them to recognize it, but I think I may not have sort of fully done so as much as when I was then several years later writing this book about it, saw the importance of it. So I think that's a great point. I think it is important to name it, and sort of to name it not just as higher thinking skills, which is the way people think about it, but as something that's as types of skills that are particularly valuable in this charged terrain of racial conversations. On the asymmetry thing, there's no question but it's whites who have most problems, so to speak, seeing the asymmetries. But I do think that, especially among younger people of color, there are some people who often think, look, if I can't do this to you, you shouldn't be able to do this to me, and don't see it. So while I think it's largely, or kind of even overwhelmingly, sort of a white problem, I don't think it's totally confined to whites. And then, but also I think that people sometimes recognize the asymmetry without fully knowing exactly why there is the asymmetry, or sort of having a whole, as it were, a sort of power imbalance analysis of it. So, I mean, in a way, that's why I think the idea of asymmetry is sort of interesting, in that the educator can use the recognition of asymmetry to sort of open that up. Although, of course, you have to have presented that, you know, structural injustice framework already in order to then help them connect this conversation, this interpersonal conversation with asymmetry, to that larger framework. And so, yes, I do think, I think I could have done more in the class to actually make the asymmetry issue itself more of a sort of a theme of the course than I did.
Hi, Larry. I've got two questions. One, I don't want to intrude on your embarrassment, but I was intrigued by the example you gave of being mortified by what obviously you hadn't seen in the particular text you were looking at, the film of it, that's right. And I was wondering if you were mortified because you had failed to take a perspective that you should have been able to take, or because you felt that the nature of your lack of awareness reflected implicit racism. I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that. I think there's two different ways you might have been mortified. Simply you hadn't got the perspective right, which is a failure of perspective taking. The other is a latent racism you weren't aware that you had, or you weren't aware that you unintentionally had expressed. So that's my first question. You don't really have to answer if it's going into areas you don't want to go into, but it certainly is an important issue. I mean, I certainly felt myself occasions when I wondered where I put my foot in it, whether it's a matter of just insensitive perspective taking, or whether it was actually some kind of latent discriminatory perspective I didn't even know I had. And the second question is not entirely unrelated. Obviously, you're focusing on race in this discussion, and as we recognise, race at the moment in this contemporary cultural context is marked by physical appearance and also explicit power relationships. And I was wondering to what extent you thought that the issues that you're talking about equally apply to minority groups who are not, as it were, marked in the same kind of way. I was particularly thinking, for example, of minority groups in Europe, like the Welsh, for example, who have been, and the Irish in the United Kingdom, who have been effectively oppressed by the English for 800 years. And many of the things you're talking about in terms of the kind of power relationships and this reciprocal, asymmetric, at least joking, if not actual discrimination, could equally well apply. And I'm wondering how much what we were talking about is tied to the contemporary definition of race as having certain characteristics, as opposed to being a more general point about minority and power relationships with minorities in any kind of context.
Let me start with the second one, Helen. So I certainly think that the asymmetry issues apply to a lot of categories other than racial categories. And I don't think that the visibility is, of course, part of our contemporary notion of race, though, as you suggested, hasn't always had the centrality that it does in this country now. But I don't want to. I mean, race is different from religion, race is different from ethnicity, but each of them have asymmetries that have to do with power relationships and marginality and centrality and stuff like that. So I completely agree that the same issues can be raised in those other contexts. I totally agree with that. On your first question about my own response, it was more a kind of ignorance. Like there had just been this thing that had happened in the film strip, and I bought into a kind of mainstream white way of interpreting it, of sort of like seeing what happened there, that just missed that the character, that the figure in the film strip was expressing racist sentiments. I just missed that. I really missed it. So I'm not sure it exactly falls into either one of your things. There was kind of a racial ignorance, but I mean, it was only the first time I did it, so
We forgive you.
No, I felt bad, but I learned something. I couldn't believe that I had missed it when I went back to think about it, but I just thought there was something to be learned from that. You can fall into these white, ignorant ways of seeing things.
I was agreeing with sort of similar experiences. That was the point. I felt, it's a not uncommon experience to have.
I mean, especially with all this, more recent attention to implicit bias, it suggests that people have like a lot of these, biases, or at least sort of bad representations of different groups that exist at these unconscious levels. It makes it seem less surprising.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the bottom of the outline about teaching about the idea of Black intellectual inferiority, and how you sort of balance and pitch that as as an academic concept, but also I'm guessing like an example of or just speak more about that.
Okay, I'm sorry, but that's a question that has a long answer, and I'm going to have to give you the long answer in order to address it in the way that I actually did in the course. So, Black intellectual inferiority, as you all know, was used to rationalize slavery. And the idea grew up as a way to rationalize slavery. So, therefore, I had to teach, in order for them to understand the idea of race, I had to sort of teach them about that history. So, a way that I handled that situation was to look at this figure that I mentioned, David Walker, who in 1829 wrote a book called The Appeal to the Colored Peoples of the World. It's just a fantastic book, which for some reason just hasn't gotten the kind of uptake it deserves. As I said, he was a Boston-based Black abolitionist. Boston was a sort of center of abolitionist sentiment, and he was close to William Lloyd Garrison. But this book criticizes Thomas Jefferson, who had died several years before. And Jefferson had been one of the most important and sort of first public figures to put in writing a claim that blacks were inferior. He did it in this book called The Notes of the State of Virginia. And Jefferson was not only a political figure, but he was a kind of scientist as well, and a great intellectual. So his words had a lot of clout. And so I had the students read Jefferson and then read, I also read Benjamin Banneker, who was a free black in the late 1700s, who also challenged Jefferson's claim that blacks were inferior. But so we read Banneker and Walker. I focused more on Walker, partly because Walker had a much more elaborated argument against Jefferson. Banneker just wrote a letter to Jefferson, which was quite differential, understandably, in its tone, whereas Walker was like outraged that Jefferson would say these things about black people. How could he say stuff like that? And Walker took Jefferson's arguments apart. He didn't just express outrage. He had these very developed arguments that were historical in character and against Jefferson. But in addition, Walker said, black people have to read Jefferson and develop their own arguments against Jefferson. And so black people should get a hold of Jefferson's writings and read them and then say what's wrong with them. And Walker was, when he was based in Boston, he smuggled copies of his book through a network back to the South, to slaves. And this partly resulted in several states passing laws that made it harder to do stuff like that, because they were quite, in other words, it really had some effect because it came to the attention of the authorities. And so, in a way, what I thought was that the use of Walker, who tied the idea of critical thinking to liberatory political activism, basically. For him, these were kind of joined at the hip. You had to sort of figure out what was wrong with these ideas, and then, you use them as part of the struggle against slavery. So that's how I handled the dealing with the black inferiority idea. So in the book, I talk briefly about this other way of thinking about a kind of civic education framework that was developed by Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy's book.
It's not out yet.
but you know, they've written about this before, about sort of the controversial issues approach, where you have you know, both sides, and then students research both sides, and they learn to develop their arguments. And I thought, you can't do that with this idea is not a both sides type of idea. And so that framework isn't really appropriate to it. So, you know, the assumption was always that the idea of race was a false idea. So that had been put in place from the beginning of the class because of the scientific critique. And so that was kind of sitting there. And then I thought that Walker was a way of, you know, when we had to really focus in on it, I thought Walker was really a good way to do that. I mean, it's a great book in its own right, but it also had that advantage. And one time, I don't know if I'd be able to find this, but a student who came to UMass Boston afterwards and then took a course with me where she wrote a reflection. I mean, she'd been a student in the class, and she wrote a reflection on the course, and she said something like, "It was a relief to us black students to learn that we were not inferior and that the idea of race was a faulty idea." So she sort of tied the general critique of race to this particular idea of black inferiority, and almost implied that she felt that she, and you know, she didn't just say herself, she said other black students as well, were, you know, lived under some burden of not being quite sure that maybe they really were in some way inferior. And so that made me, you know, think that this is not an idea that's like disappeared or anything. I mean, in a certain sense, Claude Steele's research on stereotype threat supports it. It doesn't, but anyway, so that's why I think dealing with the idea, I think it's valuable to deal with the idea, but you really have to do it in a way that doesn't give it any legitimacy at all. Sorry for that long answer. I'm also glad to have the opportunity to talk about that, partly because Walker's so great, but also because this is really an important and difficult idea. And, you know, as a white teacher, you know, that could sort of make it worse and stuff like that.
Oh, there's one. Go for it.
Were these classes recorded?
No.
So this is your recollection?
No, I'm sorry. So how did I get my material?
Correct.
So for some of the classes, I had a postdoctoral student who was kind of doing research. So I had her notes. And then the other way I did it, I also had students' writings, especially after email became sort of popular among this age group. So I used a lot of their writings. But also, I had this little micro cassette, and I lived within walking distance of the high school. So when I would leave, I would, right after class, I would basically just debrief my own memories. So it's a combination of those.
My interest is just in the notion of accountability for expressing opinions, and how did you create a non-judgmental environment where you actually could address issues of race and racism without having consequences?
So I'm not sure.
How did you open the floor to controversial perspectives? What did you do? What measures did you employ to create a space where people could feel that they could speak their mind?
Okay, so one piece, you know, the material itself already raised those questions. So it wasn't that you know what I mean? Like,
it's not the material, though, it's the individual's interpretation.
Well, but I just mean the material itself is already very charged material. So even if you just reported what was said in a reading, you're already in a way putting a possibly charged issue onto the table. It's also true that it's one thing to say, I think this, and another thing to say, you know, the person we read said it. And I think, I'm sorry, I have a complicated answer to this one as well. I think that in a way the historical perspective sometimes gives a kind of distance that allows particularly charged issues to be voiced in relationship to something in the past that might be harder if you just hit it immediately to the present version of it. I mean, many of our conversations, maybe even most of our conversations, ended up having some relationship to something in the present, and sometimes we dealt with present issues. But I do think that there's an advantage in facing history in ourselves, the professional development organization that kind of deals with issues like this. That's part of their approach too, is to sort of use history to raise moral and civic questions. In terms of how you create a space that makes people comfortable to put their stuff out there and then for somebody else to say something critical about it. I just try to model a sense of respect for people's honestly trying to say what was on their mind, and with the assumption of goodwill. Philosophers sometimes talk about this kind of the assumption of charity, where you assume that the person who's speaking has, is trying to say something authentic, and if you disagree with it, fine, you engage with that in a respectful way. Another thing that I did also, though, was to have explicit conversations about sort of rules of engagement among the students, where I asked them a version of the question that you asked me, and I said, could you guys come up with some guidelines that we could use for how to make this a space where we can all talk in a respectful way? And there was a fascinating conversation where one student said, well, maybe we should say that you can't say anything that disrespects somebody else in the class. And then other students said, that won't work basically, because you don't know what's going to be disrespectful, because that's the whole point of learning, is that you might learn that something that it seems fine inside your own head actually disrespects somebody once you put it out there. And several students in some of their reflections on the course said that very explicitly, that things that seemed fine to them, once they put it out there, they saw that somebody was upset. So you couldn't use this respect you couldn't have a hard principle and never disrespect anyone. It would basically, it's just a formula to clam things up. But I thought having the conversation was helpful, even though there was no agreement at the end, because it just raised everybody's consciousness about, trying to engage with one another in a productive and respectful way. I also think, in a certain way, high school students are more accustomed to being more out there than, say, college students are. So there's, if things get a little testy, I think that's just sort of to be expected and not really worrisome. I never really had a situation in class where somebody said something really horrible to an individual other member of the class. Maybe I just was lucky.
Can I follow up on that question and the previous one? Because I'm really interested in what is on the table versus off the table. This sort of gets back to your comment about Diana Hess's work too. So certain givens in the course that you definitely taught were included that Black intellectual inferiority is constructed, was historically constructed for the purpose of oppressing and enslaving Black people, and it's scientifically invalid. That race itself is a social and cultural construction. And there were other things that presumably were just givens of the course. Then there are some beliefs that you have, but that might be more plausibly contested. For example, you believe the racial asymmetry argument, but it's not unthinkable that somebody might put forward, a racial symmetry argument. You don't want to just say, that's crazy, that's wrong, that's antithetical to the principles of the class, but you do want your students to think about how power and race intersect, and therefore why racial asymmetry might be the more plausible sort of moral interpretation of appropriate relationships. And then there are things that were totally on the table, right? What, given racial asymmetry, what is it okay or appropriate for, one person to say to another that it's not appropriate to say back, or how should we understand a whole variety of contemporary issues, whatever. Sort of partly drawing on the question about opening up space, how did you distinguish among what was sort of non-negotiable given premise, and which you would have considered morally corrupt or offensive in some way to have be part of, legitimately contested, versus what you had opinions about but was legitimately contested versus what you thought was truly contested?
Case by case.
Okay.
I mean, certainly there were some things that I thought were definitely off the table, and then there were issues that were kind of on the syllabus, and those were like totally on the table, and and then there were things that sort of in between. So just to give you one example, one year I had decided that a discussion of whether it was appropriate for anyone, blacks and non-blacks, to use the N-word should be a thing that was on the table, and I had a unit on it. And then prior to a subsequent time I was teaching it, I was in a meeting with parents, of kind of having parents give sort of input into the curriculum a little bit. And an African-American parent said she thought it was inappropriate for that to be on the table. She said, you can teach that at the college level, but at the high school level, that's just a disciplinary issue, and you should just tell a student that they should never use that word. Well, I was quite, taken aback by her point of view, but I sort of thought about it, and I know that there are generational differences within the black community about how to think about the use of that word, and I just decided that it would be safer. I wasn't sure she was right, but I wasn't at all sure she was wrong. I thought maybe she was right. So I just decided, for safety's sake, to take it off the table. But then one day students started talking about it. And then I couldn't figure out how to implement the thing that I had agreed with her that I should do, which is to treat it as a disciplinary issue. I'd never thought about what you would do to make that happen, and I just couldn't figure out how to do it. So the as often happens in classes, things were zooming along, and I just decided I can't just say, I just couldn't figure out how to say, you can't have this conversation, you can't use that word. It just didn't feel right to me. So I let the conversation go, and I actually describe it in the book because it ended up being quite a fascinating conversation in all kinds of ways, which doesn't mean that Mrs. Pinkertooth was wrong to say what she said to me, but it's just an example of how I can't totally tell which category what things were in, and I'm sort of feeling my way through.
I can hear voices outside, which means probably they're going to flood in. So thank you very much for that.
If anyone just wants a little card that has the name of the book on it, and publishing information, it's up there.
And if you are a student at Harvard, you can get, what, a 40% discount? Is that right? If you go to the Harvard Education Press bookstore?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's right there on Story Street.
So good.
Yeah, it's just around the corner.
Any deal?
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
She didn't tell me.
I just thought this would.
I didn't want to be
I just thought
presumptuous.
sitting
You
up
feeding
here.
back.
Oh, no.
You feeding back.
No, I don't. We won't tell them anything about the school.
It's okay.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yes, it
We're
was.
actually working this year trying to revamp the
Well, you did it right, I mean, there was one. But it's okay. Yeah, and I said it's something called, I
similarly, like a lot of our
So where is how about self-awareness or something like that?
Okay.
That's happening now. We're just
Great. Terrific.
So I was curious
Oh, okay.
would be sort of like
So what are you doing for?
if you were to try to sort of teach more specifically. That's how I read it. That sort of like baseline understanding that's structural inequality. Because I end up getting really stuck at where to start and how to do that in a way that doesn't feel like you're